Amy at EuroLuxHome.com. Welcome back to our historical overview of the styles of European antique furniture. If you've been enjoying this series, please remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and maybe share it with a friend who would also enjoy learning about European antiques. So today we're talking about the Queen Anne style. The Queen Anne style of furniture is one of the most famous styles of furniture in history. Queen Anne was on the throne in England at the beginning of the 18th century. But in order for you to understand the Queen Anne style, we need to turn back a few centuries and look at what was happening in culture. We've talked about the idea that the decorative arts, especially furniture, as well as art and architecture, is a reflection of what is happening culturally in a society. And most of our videos we've done so far have focused on the continent of Europe. So mostly Belgium, France, Italy, and Germany. But now, today, we're going to turn and look at what was happening in England. And so we'll start all the way back in the 12th to the 14th century. In England, we have the Gothic style. So the Gothic style spread throughout all of Europe, and you can see that it really does look like a Gothic cathedral. The Gothic style has the flying buttresses, the pointed arches, the ribbed vaults of architectural elements that allowed cathedrals to be built very, very tall. And the point of that was to bring your eye to God. You see these same elements in the Gothic style of furniture. It really has a verticality, bringing your awareness to otherworldliness. And that was what was happening in a cultural perspective, was a theocentric universe where man was focused on God and Christianity. Now, then we talked about, as the rise of the Renaissance happened in the 15th century in Italy, there was a shift, a paradigmatic shift to man's activities and accomplishments in this world. And there was also a turning back and looking at Greco-Roman things, art and literature from Greece and Rome. And that profoundly impacted the art. And so over here behind me, we have Renaissance buffet. And so the Renaissance style began in Italy in the 15th century, and then it spread to France in the 16th century. And we talked about Francis I and Henry II as being the French kings that were great patrons of the Renaissance arts. So if we turn now to England and talk about what is happening in England in the 16th century, we have the House of Tudor. And probably the most famous Tudor is Henry VIII. He was actually on the throne at the same time as Francis I in France. So they were contemporaries. And Henry VIII is very famous for his 6 wives, and he caused quite a lot of religious turmoil because he set aside his first wife in order to marry Anne Boleyn, and he then created the Church of England and began centuries of religious turmoil. Henry VIII then passed his line to his daughter, Mary I. She's often known as Bloody Mary because she was a Catholic. She continued this religious strife that happened in England. And then eventually his other daughter, Elizabeth I, comes to the throne. Elizabeth I came to the throne right as Henry II passed away. So they were really right about the same time. And eventually, Henry's 4th son became Henry III of France, and he was actually a suitor for the hand of Elizabeth I. Now, you may know she never took a husband. She just was married to the crown of England. And so I just wanted to bring your attention to the fact that this Renaissance style is happening at the same time throughout Europe, and we've talked about it in France, and so today we're talking about the development in England. So we see a lot of these same elements of the Renaissance style in the expression in England. It's called the Elizabethan era. And we see heavy carvings, such as this buffet, lots of heavy carvings, and elements of the Greco-Roman style. So we see columns, we see behind me, you see these Renaissance type scroll work that was found in Greco-Roman mosaics and murals. So eventually, just like in France, Henry III dies without heirs, and that's the end of the Valois line in France. Elizabeth also dies without an heir, and so the Tudor line ends, and then it passes to the Stuarts, the House of Stuart. So we've recapped the 16th century, we're now moving into the 17th century. And the House of Stuart was originally led by James I, and that's how it gets the name Jacobean. So we pass from the Elizabethan style to the Jacobean style, but really in essence, it's pretty much the same. Very heavily carved, dark furniture, dark wood such as oak, big massive proportions. And so this style continues throughout the 17th century in England. Now, the throne passes from James I to Charles I, but remember I've mentioned that Henry VIII has really stirred up all of this religious turmoil. We also have political strife happening, and just like we saw in France under the French Revolution, here in England, the people rise up against Charles I, and he's actually executed. And that becomes the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. So it's a very politically turmoil time, a lot of violence, and the people are rising up against this idea of an absolute monarch. Now, by the end of the 17th century, the monarchy is restored in England under Charles II and then under James II. At the same time that James II is on the throne in England, we have Louis XIV on the throne in France. So it's a big difference you can see there. With Louis XIV in France, he declares, I am the state. He is the absolute monarch. And we see the rise of the Baroque style. Now in England, under James II, the people have just had enough of the absolute monarchy. And the Baroque style really didn't spread to England in the same way that it spread to the Catholic countries. You might want to go check out our Baroque and Rococo video, and we talk more about the reasons behind the Baroque style, one of which is the Catholic Counter-Reformation and trying for the Catholic Church to reestablish its power. But because England was predominantly a Protestant country, we don't see as much of the spread of the Baroque style into England during this 17th century. So, James II is on the throne. He is a Catholic. Again, the English people have just had enough of all of this religious turmoil, and there is another revolution. This one is called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And the people rise up, set James II aside for his daughter, Mary II. So Mary is actually already married to William of the Netherlands. And so they jointly begin to rule England as William and Mary. That's William III and Mary II of England. And now we find a predominant shift, a very significant shift in art, because we have had a very important shift culturally. So let's explore that a little more. So the House of Orange is William and Mary, and they have come to the throne by 1689. Again, it's 100 years before the French Revolution in 1789. So England has already gone through this transition from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy. And that means that the monarch rules in conjunction with the parliament. It's balanced. So the parliament is elected by the people, and then you have the monarch. And so that's a joint ruling. It's a balanced form of government. William and Mary, because William comes from the Netherlands, he brings this strong Dutch influence to England. Now, the Dutch people have been traders for centuries. They are very entrepreneurial, very focused on business. And in fact, they had developed the Dutch East Indies Trading Company. And that trading company had gone all around the world. So not only were the Dutch people traveling around the world, trading, bringing goods, then this now spreads into England. And believe it or not, this is when tea comes to England for the first time. So you may have thought that the English always had tea because it's such an inherent part of English culture, but actually it was under William and Mary. Tea came to England for the first time and really changed culturally England. So you have this influx of goods, and you also have England now becoming more prominent on a global scale around the world. This is also the time that we see the rise of Delftware. And we'll do a whole nother video about the blue and white porcelain or ceramics that come out of Holland. But it was just a great craze here during the 17th century. Now, the reign of William and Mary was considered to be very economically stable. It was a prosperous time, and they also really introduced the idea of religious tolerance. So it became a time that was mostly peaceful and prosperous. And when you have good economic times, then you have the rise of a merchant class. And so people began to have a little more money, and things were going very well in society. And this now sets the stage. When Anne passes away, William continues to reign for a few more years until he passes away. And now you have Queen Anne coming to the throne. Queen Anne was the sister of Mary, and she was the last of the Stuart line. So now we've gone. We had the Stuarts, we threw them out, we brought in the House of Orange with William and Mary, but then now Anne takes the throne, and she becomes back to that House of Stuart, and she is actually the last of the Stuart monarchs. So things have really changed now that Queen Anne takes the throne in 1702, and she only reigned until 1714. So it's a very small period of time considering her impact on furniture styles. As I mentioned, the Queen Anne style is one of the most enduring styles. So let's talk about Queen Anne's reign for a few minutes. She's most known for, again, continuing this very peaceful and prosperous time, and she united Great Britain. So England, Ireland, Scotland were all separate nations, but under Queen Anne, they were all united to become Great Britain. And again, also the power of Great Britain spread during this time on a global scale. So that's what's now happening at the beginning of the 18th century. But remember, we've gone now through the scientific revolution, which had started in the 17th century. You had people focused on understanding nature, understanding man's place in the world, how things actually work. And then that spreads into the Enlightenment. We've talked about the Enlightenment is an 18th century philosophical movement, also called the Age of Reason, where it's man trying to not only understand his place in the world, but question things that maybe aren't fair, social injustice, questioning the absolute monarchy. That's what's going on in France and actually leads to the French Revolution 100 years later. But in England, we've already established that constitutional monarchy. So it's considered, Anne was considered to be heralding this new modern society. So that's what's spurring this transition from, at that point, this old style, the Renaissance style that had pretty much continued through the Elizabethan time, through in the 16th century, through the Jacobean reign in the 17th century. Now at the beginning of the 18th century, we have this new modern perspective. And so it was important for you to understand what happened culturally in order to understand why did the style of furniture change so dramatically. So now we're going to take a look at some examples of the Queen Anne style so that you can really see the difference. Okay, so I have brought in some chairs for you to look at so that we can talk more about the hallmarks of the Queen Anne style. So just to remind you, we've moved away from the classic Renaissance style. So I've brought this chair in so you can see under Elizabethan and Jacobean styles, we had very heavy carvings. You can see this is very carved. We have mythological beast here at the top, reference to Greco-Roman. We have columns. This is an Ionic column, spindles. So it's very rectilinear. It also is a little bit more of a darker wood that was predominant in the Renaissance style is the darker oak. But now, under the Queen Anne style, we're going to shift to lighter woods, walnut, cherry, maple, and we also see a lot more use of veneers for decoration. Now, the Renaissance style, as I mentioned, kind of rectilinear, whereas here we're now having these clean, curved lines. It's a bit of a lighter proportion, a little more elegant and refined. And we really see minimal decoration. So on this particular chair, you can see this marquetry pattern. So we do have decoration, and we have a bit of carvings at the top, a little bit of curls to go with our curve, but it's not as heavy and massive as these pieces behind me. So this minimal decoration, you will find flowers, a little bit of scroll work, shells, and marquetry designs. We also have the development of new forms of furniture. I mentioned that tea came to England for the first time. That was a new product. They had never had it before. And of course, the English just fell in love with tea, and that became part of their culture. But then they needed little tea tables to sit at to drink their tea. So in general, by the time we reach the Queen Anne, while Queen Anne is on the throne and the development of the Queen Anne style, we see a shift away from these big, massive pieces to smaller, more elegant and refined little tea tables. We have low boys, low chests. We also have high boys, which are taller chests. But you can see that they have really thin, elegant legs. So another element of the Queen Anne style that we find for the first time is an introduction to comfort. Sounds funny, right? So most of the time when you sit down in a chair, you want it to be comfortable. But for the first time, we're beginning to see that the back of the chair is actually curved a little bit. Now, this chair is a late 19th century piece, as is the pieces behind me. So it does curve back a little bit. But if you can imagine the actual true Renaissance and Gothic pieces, the back would be straight up and down. So when you sat in the chair, you're really straight up in the chair. And that's maybe not the most comfortable. So in the Queen Anne style, you start to have this gentle curve so that when you're sitting in the chair, you can lean back a little more comfortable. And this probably has to do with that rising merchant class that has a little more money, and now they're decorating their homes and they want things to be a little more comfortable. So that's one element, is this curved back. And we also have wing chairs being developed for the first time. And wing chairs are padded on the sides, and it said that it was to keep out the drafts. So it was to make it a little warmer when you were sitting in your chair at night, kind of tucked into your chair. So the wing chair was developed at this time while Queen Anne was on the throne. But really, the number one hallmark of the Queen Anne style, that when you're out antiquing and you see it and you recognize it, that will be your cue to know that it's the Queen Anne style. And it's the development of the cabriole leg. So let's bring your attention down here. So this is a cabriole leg, this curve. And what this is called a cyma curve. A cyma curve is when you have convex and then concave. And if you look over here to the Renaissance chair, you see we have a straight leg. So this curve begins for the first time in the 17th century. Now, we talked about a cabriole leg already when we talked about the Baroque and the Rococo style, because the cabriole leg becomes very fancy and ornate. The knee is very carved, usually with flourishes and shells, and then we have the foot curls around. Now, in the Queen Anne style, instead of that curl around at the end, we have what's called a pad foot, which really is just like a round foot. This chair is actually considered a William and Mary new chair. This is based on the William and Mary style. So we don't quite have the pad foot as fully developed as we find in the Queen Anne style, but this was the closest that I had to the Queen Anne style to show you in person. And then I'm also including pictures on the screen here so that you can see examples of that Queen Anne leg. That becomes the most famous. People today still have Queen Anne chairs in their home, Queen Anne style chairs with that cabriole leg and that bun foot, that pad foot. It's also called a bun foot, but a pad foot. So what happened to Queen Anne? As I mentioned, she was only on the throne for 14 years, I believe. And during that time, she had 17 pregnancies, but unfortunately, the majority of those were miscarriages and stillbirths. She only had 5 live births, and 4 of those died before the age of 2. It's a very sad story. She only had 1 son that survived until the age of 11 when he passed away too. So unfortunately, Queen Anne had a very sad story. She did not produce an heir, and so the House of Stuart then passed to the House of Hanover. And we'll talk more about the House of Hanover in our next video. But that sums up the Queen Anne style. I hope that you found it interesting. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and maybe even share it with a friend so that they can learn more about European antique furniture. See you next time.